After the shattering of the Elden Ring and the Great Shattering War, there was no shortage of contenders who would become Elden Lord and mend the world. But among all the failed to become monarchs, none stood closer to the throne than Round Table Knight Vaik. The item description for Vaik's Dragon Bolt incantation reads, Incantation of Vaik, Knight of the Round Table Hold, summons red lightning to bolster both the caster's body and their armaments held in the right hand, enchants armaments with lightning affinity, attacks, and increases maximum equipment load. However, lightning damage negation will be reduced. Of all the knights, Vaik the Dragon Spear was the one Lanciax loved the most. Lanciax was a holdover from an older order, the Order of the Dragons. Eras come and eras go. The mandate to rule is never eternal, it moves with the affinity of the world. It changes with the ebb and flow of powers and factions which themselves are responding to the structure and contradictions in the makeup of the Elden Ring. The stability of order itself is also contextual, and when the wishes of the kings and queens contradict what would bring the Elden Ring in harmony with the world, opportunities for conflict emerge. The dragons lost the right to rule, but found a place in the order of Queen America as objects of religious worship. Within the dragon cult, Lanciax was a priest, so it is to Vaik's credit that of all the knights whom she communed with, Lanciax favored him. But he didn't become Elden Lord. Vaik's armor description reads, No other tarnished was closer to the throne of the Elden Lord than Vaik, but without announcement Vaik traveled far below the capital and was scorched by the flame of frenzy. Did he make his choice for his maiden, or did some other force lure him with suggestion? The flame of frenzy is a great and powerful outer god, and embracing it is different because its effect is like nothing else in this world. There are a lot of alternate ideas for how the shattered order of the world might be mended and what shape the next era might take, but the flame of frenzy is chaos incarnate, and its adherents do not want the Elden Ring reforged. It is perhaps the most abhorrent outcome which the instability of order could produce, because there is no guarantee that the cycle of madness which the Lord of Madness would usher in could ever be undone. The flame of frenzy has the power to melt everything together into the absence of order, a world of pure chaos, pure madness. Yeah. In this latest entry into the reoccurring themes of FromSoft series, I'm going to discuss madness. This is the third video in this series, and if you haven't watched the previous ones, I recommend you do so in chronological order, because I'm building on many of the ideas I've been discussing so far, and I'm assuming familiarity with those videos. I will offhandedly discuss themes and ideas here which warranted 5-minute discussions in those videos, so unless you're comfortable in your knowledge of those games, maybe don't start with this one. Or do. I'm not your mom. I am AesirAesthetics. Hope you have a cup of coffee on hand. Let's dive in. Did you get your coffee? For real? If so, put the cup in front of you and start swirling it. If not, just imagine that you did. And now, etch the motion of the swirl in your head. And understand that this represents your life, your previous lives, and all the lives you will ever live for eternity, unless you become cognizant of that fact and work to step outside of it. Those who desire are contained within the motion of the cycle. To escape the endless cyclical torment of life, you must obtain enlightenment. The cycle of death and birth which governs your life moves endlessly, and it is better understood as the wheel of samsara. This wheel illustrates the afflictions of mankind. In my enlightenment video, I discussed how the moon is symbolic for enlightenment. The moon hovers above the wheel because enlightenment is how you're freed from it. Deep within the wheel, however, are the afflictions of desire, depicted as a swine, a snake, and a rooster. They represent delusion, aversion, and attachment, respectively. And these are the 3 poisons which Buddha warns about. These are the 3 roads which lead to desire, which is at the root of suffering. In From Software's games, madness is not random. There's a yearning for cleansing flames to destroy the structures around, but the desire to destroy the prevailing order is never born out of the ether. It has a root cause. The moon is enlightenment, but madness is a poison. And in the games of From Software, I put forward that madness is born from the 3 poisons of the Buddha and from an emotion taken to its extreme. If you break from the wheel of samsara, you can gain enlightenment and can ascend to a higher plane, but the mad are the ones who do not break from the wheel and instead indulge in it and ignore what the Buddha warned about. If all you wanted from the video was the core idea, there you have it. Feel free to sign off, maybe leave me a like for my troubles, but if you want to go deeper on this, stick around and get some more coffee in you. Helps us focus, helps us stave off the frenzy, you know? Elden Ring's lands between are lorded over by the Greater Will and its emissaries from beyond the stars. Through the 2 fingers, people commune with the Greater Will and can infer its intent and desires. Its supreme avatar in the land is ultimately the Elden Ring, a physical manifestation of the metaphysical laws governing the world, and the Elden Ring can be altered to suit the desires of the reigning Empyrean and the reigning Elden Lord. The forces pruned off or excluded from the Elden Ring are the outer gods. Outer because they are not contained within the Elden Ring, and gods because they are kami, manifestations of the forces of this world. There is the kami of Shifra River, who manifests as a fairy who taught the blind swordsman the way of flowing waters, which was how he sealed the god of Rot a long time ago. Then there's the budding god of Rot itself, in Melania. Cursed by the force of the scarlet rot at birth, she is destined to bloom and become its supreme avatar one day. There's the fire god of the giants, who manifests in the abdomen of his subjects and imbues them with visions of fire. There's the moons and the enlightenment they deliver to those who will dedicate themselves to their study, and the alienation of the physical world that contains them. To the end of fulfilling her moonlit path, Rani would abandon her very flesh. A very Buddhist idea repurposed and recontextualized in a very FromSoft fashion. But the most interesting of the kami is, of course, the god of madness, and its manifestation in the world as the flame of frenzy. Communion with the greater forces of this world is done with the 2 fingers, but the god of madness is different because it has 3 fingers. Which I believe to be symbolic of the ways in which you encourage the growth of the flame of frenzy within you. Submission to the 3 poisons of the Buddha: attachment, aversion, and delusion. If the flame of frenzy catches a hold on someone, their eyes begin to melt, and the flame will begin to sit in their place. The 3 poisons can afflict anyone with desire. Desire anchors you to the world around you and keeps you captured in the cycle of death and rebirth. The way attachment takes a person to desire is fairly obvious. There is something he or she wants. The story of Kisa Gotami comes to mind. She was a mother who lost her son. She asked far and wide to find someone who could return him to her, and it wasn't until she met the Buddha that she finally got a positive answer. Everyone had thought she was insane, but Buddha assured her that he could in fact return her son to her if she found a white mustard seed from a family which had not been struck with death at any point. She readily agreed and began asking around. She found many families willing to give her a seed, but none was so fortunate as to have never been struck with death. The lesson Buddha was trying to impart to her with this silly scavenger quest was to make her come face to face with how small her loss was in the face of mankind, and to accept death as nothing more than a natural step in the cycle. To accept death instead of clinging to those who are gone. And in a very, very dark way, that's perhaps the lesson which the prisoners of Latria ought to have learned. Latria was once a learned land, but ever since the queen was deposed by the old monk, it has become nothing less than a horror show for farming souls. In an old interview, Miyazaki explained that in Demon Souls, there are 2 locations designed to explore the idea of evil. The Valley of Defilement explores natural evil, and the Tower of Latria explores man-made evil. The prisoners of Latria are fed a lie to crush them. The hallways are patrolled by mind-eating, soul-sucking illithids, and the hope which the prisoners pray to is their old queen. They believe that if only they can make it to the chapel, she'll be there to greet them, and that salvation awaits those who can ascend to the upper levels. But there is no queen and no salvation. The bridge leading to the queen has a ballista in the queen's likeness, placed there to destroy all who would attempt entrance, and the chapel itself has a demon called the Fool's Idol, who was modeled after the queen and was likely fabricated by the old monk from her soul. I think the idea Miyazaki was getting at when he called Latria a place of man-made evil was that while the Valley of Defilement manifests evils which are born from the spiritual forces of the world, Latria specifically is a human organization which has been hijacked, twisted, and has been made to serve a new purpose. The Valley of Defilement could exist without humanity, but Latria could not, because it has ranks and titles. People who cling to those titles, a history with the farming of souls, items which increase soul pickups, and the evils here are seen not in the corruption of natural forces as much as they are in the torments which directly afflict people. A name wouldn't matter to the nature spirits in a swamp, but to people it does. The prison in Latria is called the Prison of Hope, because hope is what prevents people from being freed, and causes them to linger about as mindless husks, carrying meager soul power to be fed to the old monk. In the Enlightenment video we discussed how the prisoners drop Moonlight Stone, but that's not all. They also drop Mercury Stone shards. Mercury poisoning can make people mad and acquire Minamata disease, which wreaks havoc on the nervous system. It's named after a town in Japan whose citizens were exposed to the stuff for a long time. I think the reason for the prisoners in Latria dropping Mercury Stone is to connect these prisoners with madness and the Prison of Hope. Just like how the Fool's Idol is placed in the end of the gauntlet to act as a cruel betrayal of the hope which the prisoners are infected with, I think the Mercury Stones are being gifted by the old monk to torment these guys, because it looks very similar to the Dark Silver. The Dark Silver set is used by Garl Vinland, and the shield's item description reads, "The Dark Silver Shield of the Vinland Legacy." Known as the oldest of metals, the Dark Silver is said to purify dark malice. It protects the user from magics. If I'm right, the prisoners are perhaps deliberately being gifted the Mercury Stone shards and are being told it's Dark Silver. The Mind Flayers cast magics, and the Dark Silver's protective qualities would shield the prisoners against that and the malice of the land. Of course, like the Queen Ballista, like the Fool's Idol, this is a false hope. And furthermore, Mercury degrades your brains, so there's an added layer of cruelty in the prisoners having these. This is why I said earlier that it might be wise for the prisoners to let go of attachments. Because it's those attachments and the false hopes they cling to which might be doing more damage to them than anything the mad old monk throws at them. The old monk is the avatar of madness in Demon Souls. He drops the yellow demon's soul, and one of the spells we can learn from it is Soul Thirst. Its item description reads, "Spell from the demon old monk's soul, slaying enemies yields more souls when in effect. This spell gives the user a thirst for souls, taking as many souls as possible from the target. The caster's behavior mirrors that of a demon's." This spell and other Latria items like the Ring of Avarice and the silver bracelets all come back to this idea of harnessing more souls. Aside from the soul thirst magic, his soul can also be converted into the Insanity Catalyst, whose item description reads, "A catalyst wrapped in golden cloth. Forged from the soul of the demon old monk, it causes insanity in the wielder and drastically increases the strength of spells, but halves the wielder's maximum MP. If you have no dreams for the future, you may want to place your trust in the power of the golden garb." I like that phrase, "if you have no dreams for the future." We know the old monk was exiled by the queen, and I think the idea with the Insanity Catalyst and the yellow garb is that having no dreams of the future, despairing, was how the old monk went for the path of madness. An overwhelming surge of emotion is often the tipping point in these games, where a person goes from sane to mad. The old monk's Artstone description reads, Artstone of the demon old monk, his revenge complete, the old man withered, possessed by golden ropes of insanity. Too weak to be a demon's vessel, his soul was eaten. It seems he himself was nothing more than a vehicle to fuel the appetite of the yellow garb. And if you want, you can become its new champion. Allow yourself to be summoned to other worlds to fight and harness souls forever. The color yellow is often used to showcase madness in these games. Not always, but often enough that it's notable. I figure if there is a direct link to anything here, it might be Miyazaki's history with tabletop RPGs, which themselves have drawn a lot from horror writers from the early 20th century. There are short stories like Charlotte Perkin Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, and more elaborate writings like August Derleth's contributions to the Hastur cycle, and the old monk himself is very clearly, I think, inspired by the King in Yellow, an enigmatic figure from the book of the same name by Robert W. Chambers. The character was adopted by H.P. Lovecraft and his subsequent Cthulhu mythos contemporaries and collaborators. And the tabletop influences on Miyazaki, many of them drew from that mythos. The connection between yellow and insanity is interesting. Colors can mean whatever you want them to mean, but once a culturally accepted meaning has been established, it tends to linger. The yellow is madness connection isn't a connection I think most laymen would make, but there are interesting threads here. In Russia, insane asylums used to be painted yellow, and so the term Желтый дом, or yellow house, came to be used when talking about them. According to some psychologists, yellow is simultaneously an optimistic and intense color, and according to playtesting, it's the most apparent color. We use yellow to signpost headings in games about navigating in semi-realistic spaces where the art direction leans too far into looking realistic for the layout to be organizable easily to just convey the heading in and of itself, like in Uncharted or such. But also in real life, we use yellow for signposting, traffic signs, fast food signs, and the like. I ultimately don't place a lot of meaning into colors for the sake of it. Obviously, if a work establishes a color to be connected to some idea, theme, or motif, and then the color resurfaces later in the work, we can be safe in assuming the artist intended for the use of the color in the later appearance to be connected to that concept again and to evoke that concept in a new context. But picking a meaning for a color out of thin air can be done to justify any read of anything, because you can probably find an article supporting every potential read of every color. There are times where it feels more apt, like how in Sekiro, many of the creatures and peoples touched by the rejuvenating waters bleach and become very, very white, a color which, in Buddhism, historically symbolizes death. But there's also a lot of times when a color is just a color. I think the use of yellow to signal madness is repeated often enough in FromSoft's games that they are using it intentionally, but rather than drawing from the later works of Van Gogh or some such, I think the idea might just be that madness is in opposition to enlightenment, like how yellow is in opposition to blue on the color wheel. Blue is the color of sorceries, of the moon magics and enlightenment in these games, and so, if you invert it, you will get yellow. Those who seek enlightenment and escape from the fires of madness are the opposite of those who offer themselves to it as kindling. Speaking of both enlightenment and insanity, and kindling, Seath. I think Seath is one of the most interesting FromSoft characters. I hate his section in the game, but the writing is top-notch. And it does that thing I love in FromSoft games, where a narrative is repeated across time in lore in order to hammer home a point. Seath is there at the end of the Age of the Dragons, and he turns out to be a sorcerer. Gwyndolin is there for the end of the Age of Fire, and he too is a sorcerer. He is born with a moon affinity, and I think Seath is as well. The moon is symbolic for enlightenment, and these characters are born into a specific order of the world when it is ending, and their attunement for the moon seems, to me, to be the universe's invitation to them to escape the collapse of the order that birthed them and ascend to a higher plane. But they don't. Gwyndolin props up the fire-linking lie, and Seath is consumed by the promise broken to him at his birth.
He was born of the immortal ancient dragons, but lacked the stone scales which made his brothers and sisters immortal. Enlightenment is precisely what he doesn't pursue. He clings to the world around him and desperately wants the immortality he doesn't have. I just went over how white symbolizes death. Seath is often referred to as the Pale Drake. Is the idea maybe not to highlight that he has ivory skin, but that he is a member of the immortal dragon race while also being mortal? The catch with that read, of course, is that there's another white FromSoft dragon of note in the Sakura dragon who is explicitly immortal. I suppose I can backpedal a bit on how I don't like to bring in interpretation of colors, and note here, in my defense, that in Buddhism, white often also symbolizes purity, wisdom, and enlightenment. The moon. I hope I've done enough work in this series so far to convince you to just assume the moon in any case should instinctually be read as the developer's way to bring up the idea of enlightenment. What that does to Seath, if you accept my premise that he is in fact moon-attuned, is interesting. He is the first dragon blessed with a temporal existence, which predisposes him towards discovering enlightenment if he were to pursue it, because he is not eternally contained within the cycle of the world, unlike the other dragons. He could escape the suffering of the world, but instead of doing that, he hates. He yearns for what the other dragons have, and his hatred and his clinging to life leads him to abandoning the dragons and betraying them in favor of the Four Lords. He has that in common with the old monk. Both are upset at the way things are, leave and come back with evil intent. And also, both are magic and madness coded. Also, Sage Freyk's internal name is Sage Logan. So, Seath and the old monk both imprison a sorcerer named Logan. Kinda. And also, they both create creature hybrids. The old monk was getting his kicks fabricating those man-centipedes, but Seath's works are more refined. Man-Scorpion Tark from Dark Souls 2 is one such creature, and when he speaks of Seath, he says,
"We once had a master. He created us long, long ago. But he was born with a fatal flaw. He resented those who had what he lacked and became fully mired in hatred. Eventually, he drove himself mad. It was at the peak of this madness that he conjured up we strange creatures. Our master was a tragically lonely soul. Eventually, his solitude eroded his very reason. In the end, he never understood what it was that he truly lacked."
His mind was poisoned by the hatred he carried for the other dragons, the seething hatred he had for them. To the Buddha, hatred is a destructive force. Like a fire you ignite in your own soul, and it's a force which cannot extinguish itself. You need non-hatred to suppress hatred. It's interesting to think about how often the idea of sorceries and madness come together in these games. Latria and the Old Monk, sorceries and Seath, and also Ulasil. Ulasil had its own branch of sorceries. The ones we find in the base game are all some manner of support spells. They involve the manipulation of light and sight, and the hiding of weapons, the caster, the repairing of weapons, the dispelling of ailments, and the like. And they're characterized by tenderness. The item description for the Ulasil Ivory Catalyst, wielded by Dusk, reads, "Sorcery Catalyst of the Lost Land of Ulasil. Formed by enchanted white bark branches, the white bark boosts sorcery adjustment, but the sorceries of this lost land are gentle and not affected by intelligence. Gentle, light sorceries. But the DLC introduces offensive Ulasil spells, and they are dark in nature. One of those sorceries is the Dark Orb, and its item description reads, Abyss sorcery discovered by an Ulasil sorcerer on the brink of madness. Fire Giant Dark Orb. In contrast to standard soul sorceries, Abyss sorceries are weighty and inflict physical damage. Perhaps human souls, because of their humanity, produce sorceries with a more tangible presence. I really want to emphasize that the offensive spells were discovered by those on the brink of madness.
And I'd also like to point out that the offensive Ulasil sorceries might just be derivatives of the Seath sorceries.
Dark Orb is a repackaging of Heavy Soul Arrow. The Pursuers is Homing Soul Mass. The difference is in how Ulasil's sorceries do physical instead of magic damage. The Dark Fog item description reads, Abyss sorcery discovered by an Ulasil sorcerer on the brink of madness, create a cloud of dark fog. Although dark fog is, in theory, relatively close to humanity, it also happens to be a terrible poison for humans. Perhaps it reflects man's cruelty against his own. And I think that last line might be getting at the truth of sorceries and madness. Just like how the consumption of souls and the world tendency system, the purification or impurification of the world in Demon Souls, toyed around with blurring the line separating humanity from demons, I think that offensive spells push casters towards madness because they are born from a malice of their own kin. Ulasilians versus other Ulasilians. Seath versus the other dragons. The old monk who hungered for the souls of humans. I wonder if that malice is born from a hatred, and that the existence of offensive sorceries speaks to the existence of that hatred. And ultimately, it's that hatred which makes the sorcerers go mad. Maybe because it corrupts the pursuit of knowledge. The learned men of Ulasil dug up Manus in order to tease from him great knowledge, but the torments he was made to suffer eventually was everyone's undoing. He was a human being once, locked in a cell which is presumably where he was tortured. In his cell is a bonfire which might have resurrected him every time the torture went too far. His sanity was kept in check by his coddling of his broken pendant. Berserk spoilers ahead. Artorias is based on Guts, but Manus, I think, was based on Griffith. Tormented for a long time until the pendant goes missing. After that, there's a recoil within him which results in a monstrous transformation. Manus shatters the wall of his cell and finds himself in the Abyss Chasm under Ulasil, where the Abyss itself begins to be spawned from his being. And its influence dooms the ancient city of Ulasil. A great hatred emanates from Manus to those who hurt him. In his torment, maybe that hatred was all that couldn't be stripped away from him. Even his capacity to command his emotions was gone, such that he had to lean on his pendant to stay sane. The item description for his pendant, the broken pendant, reads, half of a broken stone pendant, the wine appears to originate from Ulasil. A powerful magic can be sensed from this ancient stone. Yet men of this time can neither manipulate nor sense its power, which has a distinct air consisting of both reverence and nostalgia. Keep that last part in mind because it's relevant to the other Dark Souls pendant, the useless one, which does nothing, whose item description reads, a simple pendant with no effect. Even so, pleasant memories are crucial to survival on arduous journeys. Pleasant memories, reverence, and nostalgia. This is why I think Manus held on to his pendant. It kept him human. And after it was lost, all there was left was pain and hatred. His tormentors wanted the power to hunt their own because of hatred, and they birthed within Manus a great hatred. And so I think it's fair to say that the madness and the Abyss of Ulasil were born from hatred, rather than from the knowledge uncovered by the scholars. Madness is a human response. It doesn't come from the stars. And the descent into madness doesn't need the revelation of some great eldritch truth. It just needs an emotion taken to an extreme. Speaking of the eldritch truth, however, I might be reaching when I connect, specifically, the offensive sorceries in Dark Souls and Demon Souls to a hatred which can breed madness, but in Bloodborne it is the aroma and sensation of blood that makes humans tip over into blood drunkenness. So there, at least, aggression and madness go hand in hand.
The scholars of Byrgenwerth reached for the eldritch truth.
The means to ascend, to escape the beastly idiocy and live in the cosmos. In my Moon and Enlightenment themes of FromSoft video, I went over as much in depth, but I didn't really speak about the fracturing of the scholarly factions in relation to the greater theme. I always bring up how institutions in Bloodborne mirror the older institutions in that world, and how the Ascend versus Descend, Manus versus the Choir, Birkenworth versus the Healing Church, Phantasms versus Vermin dichotomy is always representing itself, but that it reproduces itself speaks to the limited perspective the parties might have, and the Buddhist parable of the blind men and the elephant comes to mind. A group of blind men came across an elephant, but being blind, none knew what creature was really in front of them, and so they extended their arms and began to feel for what they had encountered. One blind man touched the elephant's side and proclaimed they had stumbled upon a wall. Another touched his trunk and thought what they had in front of them was a big snake. Another mistook the elephant's leg for a tree trunk. Another touched the tusk and proclaimed it was a spear. Another mistook the tail for a rope. Still another touched his ear and thought they had found an intricate fan. Each man had grasped a fragment of the truth and extrapolated from there, but what happened when the misalignments in perception came out was that the men became entrenched in their own perspective and demanded that the other blindos were wrong or were lying. The story resolves differently in different tellings. Sometimes a seeing man comes across the commotion and puts the limited perspectives into contexts such that each of the blind men understands what is really there. In some tellings, the blind men learn to talk amongst each other and from dialogue come to piece together the elephant in the room. The resolution isn't super important to Bloodborne. I'm more interested in the birth of conflict. How a man's subjective experience can simultaneously be absolutely true, but also incorrect because of the limited perspective. And how a refusal to assess the whole truth, based on a commitment to the limited truth you uncovered, can lead people to come into conflict with others, with reality, and ultimately to oneself.
I discussed in my Enlightenment video how the Eldritch truth might just be the bond between parent and child, and how the delusion of the scholars who seek something more than that is why they go mad. The delusion of the madmen of Bloodborne is the third poison of the Buddha. To achieve ascension, old blood is needed. Old blood makes the physical form malleable.
But the transformation, when it occurs, is guided by the nature of the transforming subject, and if they are a lowly beastly human, they will just become a beast. But a suitably enlightened fellow can become a great one. Master Willem of Bergenworth understood as much, and now he spends his time meditating under the moon. The choir understood as much, and so they built their base in Upper Cathedral Ward to be close to the cosmos. Lawrence and Nicholas tried to brute force the transformations with blood experimentations, but it didn't take, because nobody has the full picture. Like the blind man with the elephant, the Eldritch truth eludes the scholars of Bloodborne because they haven't adequately set their sights on what it is they are trying to grasp. At least, that's what I think the intended meaning might be. One facet of Bloodborne's madness, which is fundamentally very different to the madness in Souls, is that it has the tinge of Lovecraft. So when you uncover the Eldritch truth, or when you come into brief contact with it, your own mental faculties are damaged. The humanity mechanic from Dark Souls was reconfigured into insight for Bloodborne. It's the online consumable, and in lore it represents the depth of inhuman knowledge a person has. The lower the insight is, the better off the player will be if they opt to go for a beastly playstyle. So if they ingest beast blood pellets, or if they use the beast claws, high insight drops the player's affinity for beasthood, but it also drops frenzy resistance. The frenzy status effect is a sudden, mad explosive damage. To push back against the onset of frenzy, players can ingest sedatives. Their item description reads, "Liquid medicine concocted at Bergenworth calms the nerves. Those who delve into the arcane fall all too easily to madness, and thick human blood serves to calm the frayed nerves of these inquisitive minds. Naturally, this often leads to a reliance on blood ministration." I love that. To calm the nerves, scholars drink the sedative blood, and with time, they may become addicted to the stuff. But that addiction to blood might be the very thing ultimately driving them mad. The inverse of this is the bloodletter. Aside from being the coolest weapon in the game, the Bloodletter is also unique in that it's the only weapon capable of dealing Frenzy, and it deals it to the user. It is wielded by Braetor, and its item description reads, "The Demented Hunter weapon, brandished by Braetor, the Healing Church assassin. The Bloodletter assumes its true and terrifying form after it draws upon blood from the inner reaches of one's body and soul. This is the only effective means of expelling tainted blood, or so Braetor, isolated in his cell, continued to believe." Sedatives are thick blood which is consumed to stave off madness. The Bloodletter is a spiky red mace which induces madness in the wielder, but it staves off impure blood.
Contact with the Eldritch Truth can drive a person mad.
Staving off madness can impurify the blood, Kegari style. And cleaning the blood is done by becoming mad. Once you're in the loop of the old blood, there is no escape. The addiction will turn you blood drunk and mad. To avert madness, deepen your addiction and taint your blood. To purify your blood, go mad. There is no escape. The Healing Church is the main institution of learning in Bloodborne. It's interesting how, so far, the institutions of learning, Latria, Seath, and the Healing Church, have all been connected to enlightenment and madness. And it's also interesting how in the Nightmare of Menses, we can find hybrid monstrosities, just like we found in Latria,
just like we found in the Duke's Archive, just like we find in Ulasil.
Bloodborne does not exclusively lean on ignorance as the birthplace of madness, just like Dark Souls did not exclusively lean on hatred nor Demon Souls rely on greed.
Every facet of desire is touched on in all of these games, and we see across the series the birth of madness originating from a wide spectrum of experiences. Seath's was perhaps born from hatred, but Big Head Loken's wasn't. Maybe the scholars of Bergenworth were deluded, but does that explain the madness of the research hall patients? I tipped my hand earlier when I discussed madness, but there's another form madness can take, which, while it still owes to the same afflictions of men, has a nature far more malicious than mere personality problems or naive desire.
The three poisons of the samsara are also written about as the three fires of the samsara. In Elden Ring, every Frenzied Flame incantation's item description begins by explaining that the Frenzied Flame originated from the maddening three fingers. Above the wheel of samsara is the moon, representative of enlightenment. Deep within the wheel are the three fires. High above the lands between is Manus Celis and the Dark Moon, which Rani follows to enlightenment. Deep beneath the earth are the three fingers. One path leads humanity out of the cycle of the world, the other is at the root of the suffering of the world. Except, the three fingers and the flame of frenzy don't seem to perfectly represent the source of pain in this world. The outer gods are in opposition to the prevailing order because it precludes death. They all propose new ways of going forwards, either by embracing the stagnant life or by reimposing death into the flow. But the flame of frenzy is different. It's not the source of pain like the three poisons, but it's a proposal for an order governed by it. Rather than rise above, succumb and surrender to the pain, and overcome the wheel not by becoming enlightened, but by allowing the three fires to burn it all down. Eras come and eras go, but the Elden Ring sticks around. Its physical makeup changes to suit the tastes of those who desire it, but it remains as the governing mechanism for the world. If we walk the path of the Frenzied Flame, we can do so with Hyetta. She's the reanimated corpse of Irina being manipulated, seemingly, by Shabriri to lure us to the three fingers. I'm not sure whether or not Hyetta is some roaming consciousness which made her way into Irina's body, whether it's a new identity which Irina has gotten lost in, but it seems like she's not aware of Shabriri's plans. When he appears to us in Yura's body, he's not too fussed about actually announcing himself, and it would seem strange that if Hyetta was just Shabriri putting on an act, it would seem strange that the act would persist the way it does. Once we reach the Cathedral of the Forsaken and have been embraced by the three fingers,
Hyetta tells us,
I have touched them. The words of the 3 fingers. As your maiden, allow me to divine them. All that there is came from the one great. Then came fractures, and births, and souls. But the greater will made a mistake. Torment, despair, affliction, every sin, every curse, every one born of the mistake. And so, what was borrowed must be returned, melted all away with the yellow chaos flame, until all is one again. Those who gave me grapes howled without words, saying they wished they were never born. Become their lord, take their torment, despair, their affliction, every sin, every curse, and melt it all away. As the Lord of Chaos, no more fractures, no more birth.
Before disparities were introduced to the world, everything was still, like in Dark Souls. A grey, mist, and eternal stone dragons and nothing else. But the disparities which were born changed that. Light, dark, life, death, happiness, sorrow, thriving, suffering. Those who succumb to the madness seek, knowingly or not, to go back to the state before the disparity was introduced. Seath wanted the immortality which predated the birth of disparities. The humanity within Manus went wild. Did it grow under his torment until it broke the dark sign? Is the appearance he takes a physical attempt at representing the humanity within? Is that the madness of men? The Dark Ulusil sorceries deal physical damage, but Aldia tells us that once Gwyn subverted the flow of life, men assumed a fleeting form. Is Manus closer to what humanity should look like? Are all of the Ulusilians closer? Eudex Gundyr? Just like how the madness of Seath was born from him desiring the natural state his race had prior to the introduction of disparities, are humans transforming because the humanity within goes wild and tries to assume its true form? Is that the idea with beasthood in Bloodborne? Humans ingest the blood and transform into what they ought to be. But there's what humans want to be, and there's what they truly are. Men want a form which transcends the disparities and boundaries of the world, but most men are nothing more than bloodthirsty beasts. King Alant grew to hate mankind and wished to see the Old One destroy the world. He sought the state which preceded the soul, clarity, and the disparities of existence, a state which preceded the suffering of life. It is mad to be in opposition to reality and to think that you can have the final verdict, or that your verdict matters at all. But with the Old One, Alant has the power to enact his will. Through Old Blood, the scholars in Bloodborne can ascend. Through the Dark Soul, the scholars in Ulusil might have birthed the Dark Lord. Through studies, Seath did acquire a kind of immortality. Men find themselves in opposition to the boundaries of their worlds and wish they weren't so, and those who suffer especially. The Buddha teaches that life is suffering and that to escape from it, one must obtain enlightenment, but who is listening to that wisdom? You can argue that the price paid to fulfill the human verdict and to have it triumph over the worlds, temporarily perhaps, but still, you can argue that that price is too great to be considered, but there are some who try to pay it. In these games, the verdict of reality can be delayed, and men tell themselves that it's been undone. But the cumulative damage done always comes back at the end. You might overcome the cycle of the world for a while, but the aberrations to reality you needed to impose on the world to have your way is also a function of the world. The immortality in Sekiro is not natural, and the stagnant life of Ashina gets worse and worse until the immortality is revoked. The fire linking in Dark Souls destroys and torments the world and the people in it more and more until eventually there is no one left to trick or lie to and the fire is finally put out. Reality has the final say, and if you suffer in the world, that might not be acceptable. Men might not be able to avoid the verdict of the world, but they are not bound to accept it. They can rebel, they might never win, but they can still keep the animosity alive in their hearts. And instead of accepting the verdict of the world, their desire for an alternative can lead them to want to see the order of the world itself destroyed. And so instead of escaping the cycle of suffering, they try to burn it all down. Don't overcome or forgive or ascend. Languish on the cause of pain. Attachment, aversion, ignorance. Emphasize them, lean into them, and once the opportunity arises, destroy the structures of the world. Melt it all down with a yellow chaos flame. The occasion where Buddha spoke about the 3 poisons as the 3 fires was in the Fire Sermon. It was a sermon given to the bhikkhus, which uses fire to emphasize the teaching he brought with him. Bhikkhus, all is burning. And what, bhikkhus, is the all that is burning? The eye is burning, forms are burning, eye consciousness is burning, eye contact is burning, and whatever feeling arises with eye contact as condition, whether pleasant or painful, or neither painful nor pleasant, that too is burning.
Burning with what? Burning with the fire of lust, with the fire of hatred, with the fire of ignorance.
Burning with birth, aging and death, with sorrow, lamentation, pain, displeasure, and despair. To escape the burning, seek enlightenment and reach nirvana. Interestingly, the word nirvana derives from Old Sanskrit and Pali languages, and its literal translation is something akin to the blowing out or the extinguishing of fire. And the fire is the 3 fires. I think madness in Elden Ring, and to a large extent the previous From games, has a lot to do with the submitting to the fires of desire. But I also think there is an intentional malice to the flame of frenzy which we don't necessarily see in previous games. At least not to the same extent, because another idea that is often touched on here is how the flame of frenzy is born in or takes a hold of those who suffer unjustly. Strewn around the lands between are the merchants. The merchant armor set's item description reads, "Finery of the nomadic merchants, decorated with tiny gems in a wide spectrum of colors." These merchants once thrived as the great caravan, but after being accused of heretical beliefs, their entire clan was rounded up and buried alive far underground. Then they chanted a curse of despair and summoned the flame of frenzy. The Shibriri's Woe Talisman item description reads, "Disturbing likeness of a man whose eyes have been gouged out. The corners of his mouth are upturned in an almost flirtatious manner, constantly attracts enemies' aggression. It is said that the man, named Shibriri, had his eyes gouged out as punishment for the crime of slander, and with time, the blight of the flame of frenzy came to dwell in the empty sockets." I don't think it was Shibriri who accused the merchants of heretical beliefs, but these ideas come together pretty neatly.
Shibriri wanted to spread the flame of frenzy, and he did so by slander. If the great caravan was indeed not guilty of the heretical beliefs they were accused of, then that accusation would be slander as well. With Manus, we saw the culmination of an idea which FromSoft has since gone back to a few times, and which is fully birthed with the flame of frenzy. A malicious madness which is brought about through no fault of those who suffer. The madness of the flame of frenzy is born from pain like it always is, but the pain is not the result of a disharmonious relationship with reality or a submission to the poisons in a conventional sense. Instead, pain is inflicted to the undeserving. What would you call someone who did that? Who accused others specifically to birth pain and madness within them? Shibriri wants to spread the flame, and his weapon of choice seems to be slander and accusations. He is named after a demon from Jewish folklore who shatters the eyesight of people. In Elden Ring, the sickness of the flame of frenzy began with him, and it grows in the eyes, and if we want to take the Hebrew origin for Shibriri's name a bit further and extrapolate it to his conduct, it is interesting to note that the Hebrew word for accuser is Satan.
The merchants suffered, and like those who suffered whom we've already discussed, they would have done better to let go, because the hatred which burns within, if it is embraced, births only madness. Those who fall under the influence of madness here all cling to someone. Irina clung to her father clung to Irina. Vaik clung to his maiden, Yura clung to Eleonora. Shabriri lures us by asking us to spare Melina. And Mitra clung to Nanaya. Nanaya is named after an ancient Mesopotamian goddess associated with love, beauty, fertility, and wouldn't you know it, the moon. She was the wife to Mitra, a scholar, a sage, and holy man, given that he lives in a manse near a church. Yet again we see a scholar who loved enlightenment, or some fleeting vision of it, brought to madness. But Mitra is not the old monk, or Seath, or Mikolash Ulasil, or Lawrence. I suppose his love for Nanaya speaks to an attachment. His man's and great library as well, but that's not where his madness was born. Instead, his is the madness of the flame of frenzy, born from one who has been unjustly accused. Mitra was made to feel pain, and he was given a choice. Overcome it, or succumb to it. Enlightenment or madness. And he chose to endure. In the simile of the saw, the Buddha instructed to the monks whom he was addressing. Even if bandits were to carve you up savagely, limb by limb, with a two-handled saw, he among you who lets his heart get angered even at that would not be doing my bidding. Even then you should train yourselves. Our minds will be unaffected, and we will say no evil words. We will remain sympathetic with a mind of goodwill and with no inner hate. We will keep pervading these people with an awareness imbued with goodwill, and, beginning with them, we will keep pervading the all-encompassing world with an awareness imbued with goodwill. Abundant, expansive, immeasurable, free from hostility, free from ill will. That's how you should train yourself. I wonder what that sermon would sound like to a man who was going through the motion. It is easy to commit to this mindset when you're safe in your monastery, but what would it mean to endure the pain? How long before you break? Mitra made his choice, but Mitra had a breaking point.
Enough. I have endured more than enough. I ask you forgive me, dearest Nanaya.
Mitra removes his head, and in its place glows the black and yellow flame of frenzy. We've seen that before. But Solaire was deluded, tricked by the fire-linking lie and obsessed with uncovering a son of his own. Mitra, the Lord of Frenzied Flame, also has an eerily similar look to Goldmask, except Mitra is wearing the yellow cloth we know to associate with madness. The Buddha explained that the urgency of the task before his pupils was to be made such as if their very heads were on fire. The practice is intended to extinguish the fires of one's consciousness, and so the avatar of the outer god of madness has had his entire head replaced with flames. After the shattering of the Elden Ring and the Great Shattering War, there was no shortage of contenders who would become Elden Lord and mend the world. There has also been no shortage of those who would become the Lord of Frenzied Flame. Mitra tried but failed because he was too weak. Nanaya clutched the spinal cord of another, failed to become Lord. If we follow the path Shabriri puts before us, we can become the Lord and succeed where others failed, by burning down the Erd Tree and destroying all boundaries of the world. I started this video talking about Round Table Knight Vaik. He was the closest to the Elden Ring, but he was lured by some force to abandon that path and instead pursue the Three Fingers. It's strange to think that the proposal Shabriri makes would be enticing to anyone. Don't sacrifice your maiden, sacrifice the world, including the maiden. And it's also interesting that chaos is so directly linked to the worst ending. FromSoft's games explore the beauty and horrors which are born when the boundaries of the world start to unravel. And in linking the flame of frenzy to chaos, there's clearly a line being drawn which says that however much beauty you can find in a world which allows for alternate ways of life to flourish, to discard the order entirely is bad. In Demon Souls, Maiden Astrea removes the souls from those who suffered. The soul is where man gets his clarity from, and without it the denizens of the Valley of Defilement became unable to comprehend their suffering. But are they not still suffering? The prisoners of the Tower of Latria are also soul-starved, ripped out of them to feed the appetite of the old monk. But cognizant of the fact or not, are the prisoners not still suffering? Shabriri wishes to burn all that divides and distinguishes, and he promises that this will end the suffering. But will it? Or will it just make people unable to grasp the suffering? Was suffering born from the borders and disparities of the world, or is it innate to being? Vaik was too weak to become Elden Lord. He can be encountered in the Frenzied village, where he invades those who try to reach the church where his maiden's corpse rests. And he can be encountered in the Ever Jail, where he was imprisoned. In the first encounter, he uses Flame of Frenzy incantations, in the second he does not, relying instead on his dragon incantations. It was in weaponizing Vaik's love of his maiden that Shabriri, assumably, lured him to the Three Fingers, and even in madness, his will is strong enough that he still stays by her side in what capacity he can and prevents others from stumbling upon her. I wonder if his Everjail imprisonment was done by a third party, or whether he chose that for himself. He embraced the Flame of Frenzy to spare his maiden. Did he realize his mistake? Did he willingly imprison himself such that the Three Fingers could not use him as their avatar to burn down the Erd Tree?
His head does not glow with the flame of the Lord of Frenzied Flame. Did his attachment to his maiden give him the strength to endure the madness? He wanted to spare his maiden the fate of burning herself to destroy the Erd Tree, and to do that, he paid a hefty price. But he paid it in full. There's something to admire about that. In the Kegare video, I hope I remembered noting that impurity and the spiritual disharmony it brings is not a moral judgment or sin in a traditional sense. You can be a good person and become unclean through no fault of your own. And however good and virtuous your other qualities might be, if you track impurity in your soul or on your person, willingly or not, knowingly or not, the consequences are the same. I find the story of the Flame of Frenzy to be particularly touching. Madness is born from pain, which is born from desire, but the Flame of Frenzy is not born from mere suffering, but specifically unjust suffering, manifested from the grief and despair of those who are accused and punished for crimes they did not commit. To the old monk, to Seath or Mikalash, you can point to personality problems. Each one of them brings madness about through their deliberate embrace of insanity over harmony with the world, and because they allow themselves to be led to desire. The mad in Elden Ring tracked madness on their person through, comparatively, no fault of their own. But like Kegare, it doesn't matter. Maybe you invited the pain into your life, maybe it came through deception or violence. All the same, in the end, the mad are the ones who submit to the pain. I suppose that's why Vaik is my favorite character in this game. He's a lot like Ludwig from Bloodborne. Ludwig went off the deep end, but the vision of enlightenment pulled him back. Vaik went off the deep end, but he didn't go all the way, and now he protects his maiden. Love is an attachment, but as the case was for Manus, perhaps reverence, nostalgia, and pleasant memories help some part of Vaik survive in the light of the madness within him. But then again, maybe the grasp of the fingers didn't touch him right. Perhaps his armor intercepted the embrace and left him too hobbled and too cooked to continue in his labors. Whatever the case, It is the mad version of him that guards the maiden. Surely that counts for something. That sort of devotion is not common in the lands between. The most prominent relationship in the game might be Radagon and Marika, and they are in conflict with one another. Marika is being punished for her transgressions, and Radagon is summoned from within her to protect the Elden Ring. The Elden Ring she shattered. The governing mechanism of the world, the origin of conflict and pain as well as order and peace. Everything and everyone, and all they touch and want and feel and strive towards are in the orbit of the Elden Ring. Because it is not just a powerful weapon, it is a physical manifestation of the cycle of the world. The cycle of the world is the law of the world itself. Align with it and be saved, go against it and you will be punished. Misunderstand it and be broken on its frame. In the next Themes of From Software video, I'm going to discuss the cycle of the world in depth. If you want to support this series and get access to the episodes as they are assembled ahead of the publishing schedule, I encourage you to join the channel Patreon over at patreon.com/medievalmegaman. I also encourage everyone watching to keep an eye out for the Madness of From Software livestream I'm going to be doing /did not long after this video's public release. There's so much content unused because these scripts go through so many phases in development, and if you have any questions or want me to elaborate on anything here, that livestream is where to go. Of course, I try to stay active in the comments, so don't hesitate to ask there or in the Discord server, where I'm more flexible with my time and can usually get to things faster. These videos are a commitment to assemble, and my work is made easier with the efforts of the larger FromSoft community. This time, I'd specifically like to thank SmoughTown, VaatiVidya, Hawkshaw, and SinclairLore. In the description box, I've left links to these creators and videos of theirs I'd highly recommend watching. There's SmoughTown's video on the Flame of Frenzy, Hawkshaw's video on Midra, Vaati's video on the Lord of Frenzied Flame, and SinclairLore's video on the Healing Church. I'm AesirAesthetics. Hope you enjoyed your time here. That's 3 down, 2 more to go. See you in the next video.
Listen close, and you too.